this is my topic today, Problems of Moral Communication, a Taoist View. I'm aware that it's a very sensitive period because of the shootings in Belgrade. So I hope you will not find this topic inappropriate. To the contrary, I hope at least some of you might find it helpful even in the current situation. Okay, I'm going to use this. As Uraj already said, the basic ideas of the book, of the talk, correspond to the basic ideas in this book, which published about 15 years ago, The Moral Fool. So that's just some background information. Now, a while ago, I was invited to participate in a conference in Beijing about basically the topic was formulating a minimalist morality for a planetary order. And the basic premise of that conference was a very common premise, namely that in order to basically save the world, to deal with major problems like global warming, or now we have like a war going on very nearby and so forth, that in order to solve such large-scale problems, what we need is a shared and practicable minimalist morality. Minimalist in the sense that it's like some basic moral principles everyone should be able to agree on, right? And that's a common idea. What is sorely needed, again, that was the idea of that conference, is a morality on a planetary scale. Because we have these apocalyptic times, the pandemic was ravaging at the time, extreme weather events have become normal, and as I just said, that now in addition to that, we even have a war. I am skeptical about that premise, that such a minimalist morality is really what is needed. Because first of all, I think such a thing as a shared, however minimalist morality at a planetary scale is neither possible nor realistic. And moreover, I would even like to propose that morality cannot be effective in dealing with major crises like war, climate, or pandemic. And so in contradicting the mainstream view that is in search for a minimalist morality, I'll make a different proposition, namely that something like a minimal amorality is perhaps more realistic and more effective. And again, that's what the talk will be about. At that time, it was just about the start of the war in Ukraine. And this is a CNN piece at that time. And I think it made a very valid observation. This is a CNN piece, so it started by saying the morality is black and white here. From CNN's perspective, of course, black is Russia and white is, Ukraine and EU and so forth. So they said, okay, there's very clear the war is kind of a huge moral problem, and the moral kind of blame and can be clearly pinpointed. However, the article also said, and I think that's very important, but diplomacy never is. Right? And already at that time, something which I guess will be soon inevitable, there have to be concessions that come with negotiations that are often painful. And one of the reasons why the negotiations are painful, not just because you have to make material concessions, whatever, but of course one of the major reasons why it's painful is because it hurts your moral feelings, right? You have to come to a compromise with evil on the other side. And that's very problematic, that's very hurtful. However, in order to resolve the crisis, to move on from war to peace, what is needed, and that's already pointed out in the CNN piece, is basically a suspension of morality, right? You solve the crisis by not insisting on your very strong moral judgments and moral feelings, but in order to move on from war to peace, you basically have to suspend morality. And that's what I would call a minimalist amorality. You have to basically create a space that is, so to speak, a safe space, ironically, where morality stays for a moment outside the doors, right? this idea of creating a moral space is something that I derive because my background is in Chinese philosophy, very old Chinese philosophy, Taoist philosophy, that I actually derive from Taoism. And I think that's a major, major topic in Taoist philosophy, a kind of a promotion of amorality. And I will just show you a very short clip of a story from the text Zhuangzi, which is one of the most famous Taoist texts. And the text has a lot of stories. And on one of the channels, I'm animating these stories. And I show you a little clip here about one of these stories. Let's see how that works.
Owls and crows crave mice. When humans sleep in a wet place, they may get a pain in their waist that makes them feel half dead. But is this so for an eel? Up in a tree, humans get nervous and tremble with fear. But is this so for a monkey? Do any of these three know the correct place to live? Humans eat animals they feed with grain. Deer eat grass. Centipedes are eaten by snakes. And birds, like owls and crows, crave mice. Do any of these four know the correct sort of taste? Monkeys mate with other monkeys. Deer mix with other deer. And fish are at ease with other fish. Lady Li and Mao Xiang are found attractive by people. But when fish see them, they dive low. When birds see them, they fly high. And when deer see them, they run fast. Do any of these four know the correct kind of sexual desire?
So this is a story from the Zhuangzi. And basically, I think it's pretty obvious, also in the context of the story, that the story is about some form of basic idea of morality. In the sense that all these different kinds of animals, they have different ways of life. And you can somehow also interpret this as different kind of lifestyles, different kinds of moralities, right? What is the right thing to eat? What is the right thing to, where's the right place to live? What's the right way of living? What's the right way of having sex and having partnerships? Now, I think the story actually is about the following problem. The Zhuangzi, that's the name of the text that the story is from, makes somewhat fun of humans because unlike animals, they not just live how they live, and the story is about the most basic things again of living, eating, way of life, procreating, having sex, right? Humans do not just do this, they also tend to think that their respective way of doing this are the right way of doing it. And that's kind of a typical center of, that's let's say, the source of morality is conceiving of these basic, let's say, ways or forms of life in moral terms, right? That we add, so to speak, a second coding to it. And this is at the core of morality, that we communicate about the basic things in life in terms of right and wrong, and specifically in terms of morally right and wrong. Right? But of course, if we do this, then we also think that the preferences and the ways of life, if we think about our own preferences and ways of life as morally right, then of course we also think the others who don't practice it the way we do are morally wrong. And again, I think that's what the story is about, that the story is basically an analysis of the human condition of constant quarreling, We are constantly quarreling. And the reason that we are constantly quarreling is that we impose this code, shi and fei in Chinese, right and wrong, on everything we do. So the story in one way basically shows that morality causes rather than solves human conflicts. Animals don't have these conflicts, but humans have them, and they are caused by basically the moral coding, the moral communication of our basic, let's say, lifestyles. Now, I want to show you another clip from the same story because the story is part of a dialogue between one person, some form of fictitious humorist, Taoist master. His name has the funny name King Kid, if you translate it into English, and his kind of student who wants to learn wisdom from him. And the story basically illustrates a point that King Kid, the Taoist master, is making to the student. So I show you this clip 7:15 to 9:10 as well.
It is part of a dialogue between a fictional Taoist master and a questioner. As is often the case in the Zhuangzi, their names are weird and ironic, like rap names. The master is called Wang Ni, or King Kid, and the questioner is Ni Chui, or Tooth Gap. Tooth Gap asks King Kid if he knows of anything that everyone agrees is right. King Kid responds quite brashly, "How would I know that?" When Tooth Gap poses the Socratic question, if he knows that he doesn't know, or if no one knows anything at all, King Kid repeats, "How would I know that?" To demonstrate his unwillingness to talk in terms of such knowledge, King Kid brings up the three examples of various species living, eating, and procreating in different ways without knowing what they do is correct or not. He declares that as far as he is concerned, debates about knowing correct moral values and right and wrong are Vanran Yao Luan, which translated into colloquial English means something like quite screwed up. King Kid stresses unmistakably, "How would I know how to debate such things?" Seen in this context, King Kid's primary concern is not epistemological. He is not so much interested in the intricacies of knowledge production as in avoiding the mental and social damage resulting from moralistic quarrels, resulting from different claims to know what kind of behavior is correct. By means of humor, the story questions the value of such quarrels.
So basically, by being framed in this dialogue between King Kid and his student, I think what the story shows is the following. King Kid refuses to communicate morally, right? The students ask him if he knows, can teach him about right and wrong. And then King Kid basically says, "I'm not going to communicate with you on these terms." And the reason for this is, as King Kid says, that this kind of moral communication, the mode of moral communication, or judging morally, is somehow both socially and psychologically unhealthy. As he says, it creates something like disorder. It's screwed up. So this is, I think, an interesting approach, which is essential, again, to understanding the Taoist take, why it is a problem to engage in moral communication and in moral thought, because it's unhealthy. Taoism is very much at its bottom, like you maybe know about Chinese medicine, strongly influenced by Taoism. So Taoism is basically interested in wider notions of health, including mental and social health. And so that's precisely here, I think, the reason in a Taoist context why King Kid says, look, if we start engaging in these kind of moral questioning and in these kind of moral debates, we're actually producing some sort of unhealthy, unproductive, let's say, interpersonal atmosphere, and thereby we're also producing unhealthy mental states in one another. Now, that's the Taoist background. Now I want to address a kind of different part of my presentation, the question, what is morality? Because I used the word, but I didn't really define it. There are basically three common understandings of what morality is. The first one is that morality is a personal or interpersonal quality, right? A good person, right? We think it's actually a personal characteristic. And you have like huge philosophical traditions which are about that. Aristotle's virtue ethics or Confucian role ethics, they're basically all about building people morally, building their moral character, shaping their their moral qualities, right? It's some form of personal cultivation, training people to become more moral rather than less moral. Now then, when we move on to modern philosophy, we have different approaches. We have, specifically in the Anglo-American tradition, already early in the 18th century or even prior to this, we defined morality no longer as the quality of a person, but as the quality of an act, what you do. What you do is either morally good or bad, and this can then be somehow measured, and then we have utilitarianism and pragmatism, which is no longer really interested in the personal qualities of a person, but in just understanding, let's say, the moral qualities of actions, and then acting accordingly. And then we have a third case in the development of moral philosophy, the German way of looking at things, which looks at principles, right? So it's not about, neither really about personal qualities, morality, not even about what you do, actually, what you concretely do, but about the principles that inform your actions. And so then the idea is morality is actually some form of set of principles that we can somehow, through philosophical activities, somehow find out. And then this leads up today when we all this talk about human rights, for instance, right? We think that there are some sort of moral principles, and if we only can find and define these principles, and then we know them, and then we can somehow put them into law or whatever and practice them. So these are the three common ideas of what morality is, either personal quality, quality of actions, or the quality of certain principles. Now, I think all these definitions are wrong. I do not agree with any of these three definitions. I think rather, maybe you can somehow connect with this since you're at the Faculty of Media and Communication, I think morality is best understood as a type of thinking and specifically as a type of communication. It's a specific way of communicating, which relates directly back to the Taoist story, where also morality is treated as a kind of way of talking about things, right? So in another way, morality is just making moral judgments, either in thought or in language, communicating moral judgments. Now, in order to support my point, I just want to critique in more detail the three common understandings of morality which I think are wrong. The first one, again, is that people, and that's a point 1 or 2, people or their actions, are people or their actions moral? I think if we really want to understand what people do, we shouldn't, look at their moral qualities, look at in how far they are evil or not. And it also doesn't really make sense because it's impossible to somehow measure in a utilitarian form the moral quality of an act. I think these are spooks, to speak with Stirner. In fact, I think it's pretty obvious if we want to understand an action, we have to look at all kinds of complex biological, psychological, and sociological factors that contribute to an action, a violent action, including actually the action of a shooting, which is, I composed this before the Belgrade events, is what exactly the Stanford scientist, the example a Stanford scientist, Robert Sapolsky, gives where he discusses a shooting, right? And let's listen to him. It's a long section here, 4:13 to 10:29.
Instead, every bit of behavior has multiple levels of causality. Let's look at an example. You have a gun. There's a crisis going on, rioting, violence, people running around. A stranger is running at you in an agitated state. You can't quite tell if the expression is frightened, threatening, angry, holding something that kind of looks like a handgun. You're not sure. The stranger comes running at you and you pull the trigger. And it turns out that thing in this person's hand was a cell phone. So we asked this biological question: what was going on that caused this behavior? What caused this behavior? And this is a multitude of questions. We start, what was going on in your brain 1 second before you pulled that trigger? And this brings us into the realm of a brain region called the amygdala. The amygdala, which is central to violence, central to fear, initiates volleys of cascades that produce pulling of a trigger. what was the level of activity in your amygdala 1 second before? But to understand that, we have to step back a little bit. What was going on in the environment seconds to minutes before that impacted the amygdala? Now, obviously, the sights, the sounds of the rioting, that was pertinent. But in addition, you're more likely to mistake a cell phone for a handgun if that stranger was male and large and of a different race. Furthermore, if you're in pain, if you're hungry, if you're exhausted, your frontal cortex is not going to work as well. Part of the brain whose job it is to get to the amygdala in time saying, are you really sure that's a gun there? But we need to step further back. Now we have to look at hours to days before. And with this, we have entered the realm of hormones. For example, testosterone, where regardless of your sex, if you have elevated testosterone levels in your blood, you're more likely to think a face with a neutral expression is instead looking threatening. Elevated testosterone levels, elevated levels of stress hormones, and your amygdala is going to be more active and your frontal cortex will be more sluggish. Pushing back further, weeks to months before, where's the relevance there? This is the realm of neural plasticity, the fact that your brain can change in response to experience. And if your previous months have been filled with stress and trauma, your amygdala will have enlarged. The neurons will have become more excitable. Your frontal cortex would have atrophied, all relevant to what happens in that 1 second. But we push back even more, back years, back, for example, to your adolescence. Now, the central fact of the adolescent brain is all of it is going full blast except the frontal cortex, which is still half-baked. It doesn't fully mature until you're around 25. And thus, adolescence and early adulthood are the years where environment and experience sculpt your frontal cortex into the version you're going to have as an adult in that critical moment. But pushing back even further back to childhood and fetal life and all the different versions that could come in. Now, obviously, that's the time that your brain is being constructed, and that's important. But in addition, experience during those times produce what are called epigenetic changes. Permanent, in some cases, permanently activating certain genes, turning off others. And as an example of this, if as a fetus you were exposed to a lot of stress hormones from your mother, epigenetics is going to produce your amygdala in adulthood as a more excitable form, and you're going to have elevated stress hormone levels. But pushing even further back to when you were just a fetus, back to when all you were a collection of genes. Now, genes are really important to all of this, but critically, genes don't determine anything because genes work differently in different environments. Key example here, there's a variant of a gene called MAO alpha, and if you have that variant, you are far more likely to commit antisocial violence, if and only if you were abused as a child. Genes and environment interact, and what's happening in that 1 second before you pull that trigger reflects your lifetime of those gene-environment interactions. Now, remarkably enough, we've got to push even further back now, back centuries. What were your ancestors up to? And if, for example, they were nomadic pastoralists, people living in the deserts or grasslands with their herds of camels, cows, goats, odds are they would have invented what's called a culture of honor, filled with warrior classes, retributive violence, clan vendettas, and amazingly, centuries later, that would still be influencing the values with which you were raised. But we've got to push even further back millions of years. Because if we're talking about genes, implicitly, we're now talking about the evolution of genes. And what you see is, for example, patterns across different primate species. Some of them have evolved for extremely low levels of aggression. Others have evolved in the opposite direction. And floating there in between by every measure are humans. Once again, this confused, barely defined species that has all these potentials to go one way or the other. So what has this gotten us to? Basically, what we're seeing here is if you want to understand a behavior, whether it's an appalling one, a wondrous one, or confusedly in between, if you want to understand that, you've got to take into account what happened a second before to a million years before, everything in between. So what can we conclude at this point? Officially, it's complicated. Wow, that's really helpful. It's complicated, and you better be real careful, real cautious before you conclude you know what causes a behavior, especially if it's a behavior you're judging harshly.
Right, so the last sentence is really important for me, right? Be very careful when judging behavior, especially be very careful when judging behavior harshly, because moral judgments are harsh and I think very much condensed judgments that decomplexify the actual contributors to an action, which, as Sapolsky here showed, are extremely complex. They have a lot to do with brain functions at the moment of the action, but they even go back to epigenetics, right? Whatever, what your mother experienced during the time you were born, right? I guess, like, I don't know exactly the generation, the age of the shooters here, but likely they were born in a period where their mother suffered a lot of stress. And then, of course, you go back to cultural and even historical, and then even like reasons by the species that all kind of contribute to explaining why an act of violence and an extreme act of violence happens. So moral judgments of people and their actions, for instance, shooting or killing someone, are, I would say, empirically speaking, unscientific. And they are very harsh at the same time. So therefore, I think moral judgments, moral communication is actually not very helpful. I want to give you a different example. I use this example because it's another example that immediately produces moral outrage, right? That's the example of pedophilia. Also, I think it's obvious if we want to understand what's a good way of dealing with pedophilia. I think the way it's now still normally being dealt with, namely by treating pedophiles as somehow the embodiment of evil, we can try to understand pedophilia biologically, psychologically, socially, and then treat it accordingly. Again, I think just as in the example with the shooter, it's not very helpful actually, even in the cases where we think that the moral kind of sentiments are clearly justified. Even then, in these extreme cases, I think morality is actually not very helpful. This is regarding to morality as, again, going back to this, as I said earlier, this is the idea that, for instance, a shooter or a pedophile is morally bad, is morally evil. That's the first definition of morality. Or that the act of shooting or the act of abusing a child is morally evil, right? And again, as I said, that's a common way of thinking, but I don't think that's actually the case. What's actually the case is that a main way of dealing with such things as shootings or child abuse is through moral judgments, through moral communication. And again, I think that's a problem. Now, how about moral laws, right? That's the third way of defining morality. Somehow saying it's very important that we identify the moral laws, like, let's say, human rights. That goes back very much to the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who was in awe, that's his tombstone, on the one hand of the natural laws, the laws that guide the movements of the sky, movements of the stars in the sky, and then he was trying to find, in the same way that astronomers had already identified the laws that govern the movement of the stars in the sky, he wanted to find, so to speak, the moral laws, that our internal moral laws that in the future will then decide how we interact with one another in society. So that's this kind of basic idea of Kant, that philosophy, the purpose of philosophy is to develop into some form of moral science, right? That we identify the moral principles, the right moral principles. And that's still, as I said, very influential until today in public discourse, that we got to find the right moral principles. And also in academic philosophy, that's still a very, very common approach in doing ethics. Now, I would say simply, such moral laws do not exist. We're chasing just like we're chasing a phantom. right? There is no such thing as objective moral laws that correspond to the objective laws of nature. So I also think that this approach is not very helpful. So if this is not morality, then what actually is morality? As I said earlier, it's a type of communication. And I get this idea, as I also explained earlier, from Taoist philosophy. But you can find the same idea also in contemporary Western philosophy or modern Western philosophy. I just have two quotes by two thinkers who are very influential to me. The first one you all know is Friedrich Nietzsche. And he said, my main proposition, there are no moral phenomena. There is only a moral interpretation of these phenomena. And that's exactly the point I was trying to make, right? There are no moral characteristics in a person. There are no moral characteristics in action. There are no moral laws. But we have, of course, moral interpretations of this in communication, in society, and also in our mind. Or, differently, the contemporary German social theorist Niklas Luhmann, morality are basically the conditions on the market of social esteem. Just as you have an economic market, and then you have that determines the value of your property, of your house, or whatever, of your fashion that you're wearing, you also have, so to speak, a market value of morality, right? Certain kind of moral pronouncements have a high value in a certain context. Other kinds of moral communication have a low value in certain contexts. So that's a completely different way, again, of understanding morality as what it actually is, rather than what we like to tell ourselves what it is actually a type of communication that generates some form of social value. Just as in economic communication, trading generates economic value, moral communication generates something like moral values. All right, so what kind of communication is morality? Well, it's a highly effective type of communication in politics, right? Everyone knows, if you have a political contest, you basically try to show that your political opponents are morally lacking and that you are morally superior to them. Of course, also in the media, if you want to do like a TV series or something, right, you have to have the good guys and the bad guys, right? Otherwise, it's boring. And of course also in academics, right? If I want to publish my paper and maybe in a top journal, then it's very helpful if I show that I am very much in favor of diversity and equity and blah, blah, blah. That will definitely increase the moral value of my paper and thereby increase the publication chances. So to distinguish ourselves, politicians stress their respective moral superiority, and philosophers stress the superiority of their moral philosophies. And of course, in the media products become more exciting, they become more attractive, they sell better if you emphasize moral differences and conflicts. In entertainment, also in the news, right? A news that really kind of points out moral conflicts, it's much more interesting, has higher communication value than a news report that doesn't do that. So basically moral communication, putting it very simply, functions by making distinctions. And if we understand this, that moral communication basically functions very simply on the basis of making these distinctions between the good guys and the bad guys, and between what is good and what is bad, what is evil and what is not, then to go back to the beginning of the lecture, then this kind of hope that better moral communication can ever lead to a shared morality is kind of illusory, because moral communication basically works by not being geared towards the consensus, but by being geared towards making distinctions and establishing distinctions. If you have no bad guys, you have no morality, right? So the idea that something like a shared morality is even possible seems to me to contradict the basic functioning of what morality is, namely a form of communication. Now, I want to give you, now that I've talked about what morality is not and what it is and what's the problems with morality, I want to finally give you some examples about what I recommend instead, namely amorality. And I'd like to give you three examples, how amorality has already been practiced in our society and has actually increased. How, so to speak, safe spaces without morality have been created. The first one is medicine. Traditionally, and I think you have no shortage of that problem in Serbia too, as far as I can judge, alcoholism. Alcoholism has been regarded as a moral problem, right? The people who drink are somehow morally problematic. And that was, for a very long time, the approach to dealing with alcoholism. Now, of course, in modern medicine, that's no longer the case. Alcoholics are no longer regarded as primarily evil, but as addicts. And so we have to treat them as addicts and somehow try to figure out how the addiction can be at least somehow reduced. Second thing that I found out, that I realized in my lifetime actually, was the switch in divorce proceedings. When I was young, divorce proceedings were still basically, legal proceedings were still basically moralized. The point was to find out who's guilty, right? Who cheated or in some other ways neglected their duties towards the spouse. And then once that was found out, mostly cheating, then that person is guilty, and that person therefore doesn't get any money, and therefore that person may also not get the children, right? And of course, it's also a big scandal. I remember my parents talking, oh, they are divorced, and you know, she was guilty, right? And so that was still kind of the very common kind of framework of looking at divorce. Now, it happened during my lifetime that these divorce proceedings were transformed from, let's say, a space of moral communication into a space of amoral communication, where you would no longer really consider who cheated or not, but you were trying to reach somehow a fair settlement between the partners and somehow divide the assets fairly and also the child care fairly and whatever. And you would basically refrain from arguing moral questions, right? When I teach in China, I always remind my students that probably they're not married yet, but maybe 20 years from now, half of them will be divorced. And because that's the statistics, right? And of course, that shows the usefulness of switching from moral communication to amoral communication when we have a society, unlike when I was a child, there were maybe only 5% of the people who got divorced, and it was kind of scandalous. Now everyone's getting divorced, not only once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times during their lifetime, right? And it makes it much easier to deal with such a common and widespread phenomenon if you demoralize it, if you amoralize it. If you would moralize divorce nowadays, it would be hell. It would be hell, right? Everyone would be constantly moralizing forever if everyone's divorced like 2 or 3 times, right? And the third example, simple example, is education. Traditionally, education, I'm fortunately a little bit too young for that. Corporal punishment was very common in education, in school education. And so the idea was a bad student is a bad person, is lazy or whatever, naughty, and so you have to morally treat them because they're lacking morally. You just smack them, right? And thereby you show them that they're evil, and then they have to correct their moral ways, and then in this way they will become better students. That was regarded as a proper way of educating students and making moral judgments about them, and then treating them in line with the moral judgment, not as bad students, but as evil people, as evil, naughty kids, right? So there also we see that nowadays low-performing students are no longer perceived as wicked, and therefore beating is not seen as an adequate response to failing assignments. So physical violence to students has been abolished because it has no educational value and has actually quite negative mental, social, and also physical effects. A person might just get hurt, right? So, of course, that we move on from morality to amoral communication doesn't mean we get rid of bad or good, right? In medicine, we still think about this is a good or a bad way to treat an addict, right? Or is the behavior of the addict good or bad in the sense that it increases or decreases the addiction? But we're no longer judging it in moral terms, right? We're judging it as medically good or bad. If you do this, it's medically either good or bad, but it's not a moral, primarily a moral thing. And like in law, divorce law, we consider what is legally good, what is somehow fair, equitable, what is importantly socially functionable, rather than what is morally good. And of course, in education, we consider what is educationally good, good for learning, rather than what is morally good and morally right. So I think that's my proposition, we should work towards something like a minimalist amorality rather than a minimalist morality. Importantly, we have to recognize that morality shapes identity. I don't have much time to talk about this, but this is also a very important aspect of morality, that it's not just a type of communication, but also a type of communication which shapes identity, very much individual identity, but also very importantly, collective identity. Anyways, it's difficult to imagine a politician or corporation or an academic who would completely stop communicating morally. It wouldn't work. They couldn't win an election, right? They couldn't publish a paper. They couldn't sell their products. But often there is no need to communicate morality. Whatever, you have a chat with a friend, teaching a class, or going to a doctor and having a medical examination, and it's now, for instance, no longer considered really appropriate that the doctor asks you moral questions or treats you morally. For instance, you have whatever, some problem of sexual nature or something, then it's clear that we should keep morality outside of the medical communication. So ethics, I think, can, even though it's counterintuitive, can be amoral. Rather than trying to find non-existing moral laws, which again still most of academic philosophy is most of the time concerned with, I think it makes no sense. Instead of doing that, ethics can rather analyze moral discourse beyond good and evil. So the function of ethical reflection would not be the search for the unfindable moral law, but actually a reflection on how moral communication works and what's problematic about it. So, and then, as I said at the beginning, there should be more encouragement for, let's say, moral safe spaces. If conflicting parties suspend their moral beliefs and communication, they cannot erase them, they cannot get rid of them, but they can suspend them, then common ground outside of the moral space can be found. So, for instance, in a crisis or a war, a shared amorality, an agreement to disagree, is easier achieved than a shared morality. So I think it's more promising for peace. That's it. Thank you.